Good afternoon all. Thank you very much for attending the second of our Nuclear Risks webinar, Emerging Nuclear Risks, Confrontation and Deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. In his speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore earlier this year, PM Albanese affirmed Australia's commitment to a regional non-proliferation agenda. Asialink's webinar series intends to provide an overview of regional security, dynamics and infrastructure to ultimately sketch some practical suggestions for the government. Our second webinar in the series, through our second webinar in the series, our panelists today will examine proliferation drivers in the Indo-Pacific. Before we begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all dialing in from today. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise their continuing connections to land, water, and community. I pay respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations peoples whose land we will be discussing today in this webinar. Throughout the webinar, I invite you all to submit questions for our speakers, who will endeavour to answer these in the Q&A at the end of the webinar. Our moderator today is Martine Letts, Group CEO of Asialink. Our first speaker today is John Carlson AM. John is a leading authority on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Vienna Centre for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation and a senior associate fellow of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. John served 21 years as Director General of the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office. Our second speaker today is Dr. Fiona Cunningham, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Fiona has held fellowships at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Stanford University, Harvard University, and Renmin University of China. Her research is focused on nuclear technology as a form of coercion in East Asia. Our third and final speaker is Sam Rockerbein, Director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program. Sam regularly writes for newspapers globally and was the founding editor of the Lowy's digital magazine, The Interpreter. His most recent book, The Echidna Strategy, Australia's Search for Power and Peace, offers a sharp insight into the Australian approach in the Indo-Pacific. And unfortunately, we've had some tech issues with this webinar, and so we will be jumping in for about 5 minutes into the conversation. Enjoy.
Taking practical steps to reduce the risk of nuclear war. The ultimate step being the elimination of nuclear weapons, but with a range of important intermediate steps towards this end. So as you suggested in your second part of that question, the role for international law here is more in providing the framework, the treaty framework, to support the risk reduction and arms control processes. States engaging in arms control limitations will need assurance that adversaries are meeting agreed commitments. So a role for international institutions will be in the area of verification and confidence building. This will require well-designed treaties and reliable verification and transparency mechanisms. I'll just touch very briefly on specific steps. There's no time to go into details here, but some of the steps that need to be promoted include ongoing strategic dialogues between the different nuclear states, the establishment of hotlines to particularly to deal with emergency situations, de-alerting, which is taking nuclear weapons off launch on readiness alert, and a commitment to no first use of nuclear weapons, and establishing talks on ongoing arms reductions. I'd see the promotion of these kinds of risk reduction steps as a key priority for Australia's foreign policy.
Thanks, John. And yeah, and just to keep in mind that we are quite focused here on what the implications of all this are for Australian foreign policy and what if anything, we might be able to do. When we come to the end of our conversation, we might just come back and foreshadow a couple of, just to revitalise or to reflect on some of the steps you've suggested as possible ways into this. Sam, you've been actually looking at the whole geostrategic situation that we face now in our region. In your book, The Echidna Strategy, you've predicted that the US will gradually withdraw from the Asia Pacific And so do you think, in the absence of the US security umbrella and power protection, which states such as Australia, Japan, Korea have currently enjoyed, could actually have the reverse effect of what that we're aspiring to now, which is an uptick in horizontal proliferation in the region? You need to put yourself off mute, Sam.
Thank you. That has to happen in every one of these calls. Someone has to do it. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you and with John, and hopefully with Fiona soon. To begin, it's worth just saying that the withdrawal that I describe in the book, in the Echidna Strategy, is almost purely psychological rather than physical. It seems to me that all the physical manifestations of America's alliance network in Asia are so well entrenched bureaucratically that they are going to be very difficult to shift. So I don't expect to see, flag lowering ceremonies in Japan or in South Korea, for instance, anytime soon. But what I do expect is for the reassurance that our allies get from the United States, for that to slowly erode. So the sense, in other words, that allies get that the United States would be able to will be willing to make major sacrifices on their behalf. That, I think, is the thing that's eroding about America's alliance network in Asia. And that is how I think the withdrawal, such as it is, will take place. And actually, Korea is a very good example of that. So when you consider the strategic environment during the Cold War, it made a certain degree of sense that the United States would offer security guarantees to South Korea, given that North Korea represented one front in a much larger US-led struggle against Soviet-led communism. For the last 30-odd years, that's made an awful lot less sense. And we're now in a situation where we've got, in South Korea, I think the 7th largest economy in the OECD, versus North Korea, which has an economy something like the size of Laos, but also happens to have nuclear weapons, including nuclear weapons with enough range to hit the continental United States. So what's now being proposed, in effect, is that the United States should be prepared to defend South Korea, potentially at the risk of North Korea destroying one or more American cities. And that, to me, is far too much to ask of the United States. And I'm not the only one who's thinking this. In fact, it seems to me the South Koreans themselves have some real doubts about this. Would the United States actually be prepared to make these kind of sacrifices on our behalf? And it seems to me the obvious, unequivocal answer is no. The United States should not be asked to make that sacrifice, and it probably won't. And so what does South Korea do in that circumstance? Well, it starts to build its own deterrent. Now, for the moment, that's not a nuclear deterrent, but it is nevertheless a strategic deterrent, which is to say it is designed to act as a deterrent against North Korea's nuclear weapons. That essentially is taking the form at the moment of what the South Koreans are calling a decapitation capability. That is various ballistic and cruise missile systems that can, at a moment's notice, threaten North Korea's leadership if there is strong intelligence that the North Koreans are about to launch a nuclear attack. And the South Koreans are developing now many of the accoutrements, many of the launch systems that would be required for a nuclear deterrent, including ballistic missile submarines. So they're doing everything short of developing nuclear weapons of their own. It wouldn't shock me at all if they approach that Rubicon and eventually cross it. Apart from anything else, there's widespread public support in Japan's a slightly different case. There's a lot of public opposition to nuclear weapons in Japan. But nevertheless, if South Korea did go down that road, you would expect that there'd be an awful lot more pressure on Japan to do the same, if only to match South Korea. So yeah, I think in short, the eroding credibility of America's extended nuclear deterrence does put pressure on its allies to go nuclear themselves.
Thanks, Sam. This is a question arising from what both you and John have said. I'm also very pleased to say that Fiona Cunningham is with us. We finally managed the link. Fiona is actually dialing in from Beijing today and got up very early in order to join us and has just come from the United States. So welcome, Fiona. Really great to see you. Sam and John, you can jump in maybe on this one too. I'm just interested in it has long been discussed, including by Hugh White, that the question of the erosion of the extended nuclear deterrent is potentially, as Sammy pointed out, in different, each country is a little bit different, but there is a driver there to really test their commitment to not become nuclear weapon states and develop their own nuclear deterrent. The argument, including in the International Commission for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament Review, was that no first use, a commitment to no first use, and the implications that might have for the integrity of the extended nuclear deterrent would provide such a driver. John, how would you respond to that by saying, wouldn't it just be better to really work much harder on reducing the kind of nuclear tensions or the dependence on the nuclear deterrent in order to achieve a security result?
Yes, obviously that's your statement is one that I would endorse. The obvious problem in allowing proliferation to go ahead is that the more states that have nuclear weapons, the more likely it is that they will be used. We're already pushing our luck rather dangerously in having 9 states with nuclear weapons. If you end up having 15 or 20, then that would become an extremely dangerous and unstable world. What you do with the likes of North Korea, that's quite a problem, but I would stress that diplomacy is and engagement are essential. I've always maintained that if there was a serious discussion on ending the armistice on the Korean Peninsula and restoring international relations with North Korea, if that was pursued, that could very well have surprising and beneficial results. And I think all our efforts should be towards reducing tensions rather than ratcheting them up.
So is that a practical idea?
I think the problem is that the incentives for actors like South Korea all point the other way. So, you know, it's a classic security dilemma. The South Koreans have an immediate threat to their north. In a world in which they have less faith in the United States to make major sacrifices of the kind that I was describing earlier, the larger proliferation concerns that arise from South Korea going nuclear are not likely to sway them, in my view. They're going to be thinking first and foremost about their own security. So unfortunately, the incentives just don't line up for the kind of restraint that I think John is calling for, rightly calling for.
So if I take that to its logical extension, then if indeed the drivers become too strong for countries like South Korea, then the proliferation dynamic really becomes quite strong. Does that logic also apply to Australia? Would Australia ever develop its own nuclear deterrent? What would be the circumstances that might lead to that situation?
Well, certainly, I think the first thing that would need to happen is, first of all, that China goes from being merely a much more assertive actor on the international stage to becoming an outright aggressive one. For instance, you know, the kind of behaviour that Russia has displayed in Ukraine in the last 2 years, for instance. So if China were to become nakedly expansionist in some respect, then that would be one trigger for Australia to contemplate that kind of action. The other thing that would need to happen is that I think South Korea and Japan would have to go first. It's hard to imagine strategic circumstances in which our need for nuclear weapons became more urgent than that of South Korea and Japan, which are, after all, simply much closer to China and have more pressing security concerns about China than we do. But even if those two things happened, and I think they're still very unlikely, the other thing that Australia would need to consider in those circumstances is Indonesia, which is a nascent great power on our doorstep. And it seems to be impossible for Australia to contemplate a route to nuclear weapons, which doesn't happen without either the tacit endorsement or even the cooperation of Indonesia. Because if we do it against Indonesia's wishes, then I think actually we are triggering a much worse security crisis than one which nuclear proliferation would be designed to prevent. So if we are building nuclear weapons because we want to stave off a challenge from China, then I think actually if we do it without Indonesia's acquiescence and potentially even their support and their cooperation, then actually we're triggering a much worse security crisis, because Indonesia is more important to us in security terms, I would argue, than China is. So I think a lot of things need to happen, and on balance, it seems to me extremely unlikely that we'll ever reach that point. The theme of the Echidna strategy, the book that I've written, is that Australia's single biggest defence asset is distance. We're a long way from China. Beijing's closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney. So it's very difficult for China to project power over that, military power over those kind of distances. And I think that can do a lot to protect Australia and will put off, I think, indefinitely any need for nuclear weapons.
Thanks. This is a good moment, I think, Fiona, to bring you into the conversation. If you would mind unmuting yourself, I'll say that ahead of time. And you know, this is in the spirit of, I'll kind of put it to you first and then maybe come back to Sam, but we are obviously quite preoccupied by the dynamics of the US-China strategic competition. And you've done quite a lot of work in understanding how China is actually managing that from its own security perspective, and what it's actually investing in terms of the hardware and the software to manage that. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about where you think China is heading on this, and what would be some of the triggers for there to be more preference for walking away from its no first use policy rather than what it's done so far?
Sure, and thank you so much, I should add, to begin with, for inviting me to join you, and I apologize for my technical difficulties, but diving into the conversation, I think probably the easiest way to answer your question, Martine, is to look a little bit at where China's come from in terms of thinking about its post-Cold War approach to specifically strategic deterrence, and thinking about, where it's at right now, where it might go. So some of the research that I have been doing in recent years, based on some fairly extensive fieldwork within China, has argued that actually China's way of dealing with this dilemma that all nuclear armed states are facing, of how they can keep on using their military capabilities to pursue political objectives like stopping Taiwan from becoming a more independent country, in China's case as being a kind of central political objective, how they can do that without triggering a catastrophic nuclear conflict when any sort of cross-strait conflict is likely to at least entail the possibility of US involvement. And so what I argue is that China's approach to dealing with this problem is something I call strategic substitution. And what that basically involves is that rather than like Russia adopting a first-use nuclear strategy as a way of compensating for difficulties of achieving a decisive conventional victory, or in the US case, really leaning heavily on very sophisticated conventional military capabilities backed by its own very sophisticated nuclear arsenal as well. China has instead pursued a strategy where it has pursued what I call information age weapons, so these kinds of non-nuclear capabilities that can have strategic effects, like offensive cyber operations that could attack an adversary's homeland critical infrastructure and military networks, counter-space capabilities, and of course its conventional missile force that it has deployed extensively in the last sort of 2.5 decades. So what all of these capabilities do is that they give China the opportunity or the ability to threaten to escalate any conventional conflict it might have difficulty winning a decisive victory in, but without needing to reach for its nuclear weapons in doing so. And what all of these kind of non-nuclear capabilities have in common also, though, is that they're kind of entangled with China or US nuclear support assets or nuclear delivery assets. So they have this kind of ability to manipulate nuclear risk without China needing to actually threaten the use of nuclear weapons. And it's paired together with this retaliatory nuclear strategy and based on China's no first use policy, and therefore sort of dares an adversary to be the first one to be using nuclear weapons in response to these very provocative non-nuclear attacks. And the reason that I think China pursued this strategy is because it faced constraints on how it was going to try and achieve its political objectives in any future conflict across the Taiwan Straits. In the early sort of late 1990s, when it first developed that was facing this problem for the first time following the 95-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, China simply didn't have the military capabilities to make US intervention in a Taiwan contingency too dangerous or too costly. It didn't have the kind of conventional military capabilities. It was going to take a very long time for it to develop conventional capabilities that would be able to sort of execute those missions across the Taiwan Strait. And also its leaders did not believe that threatening to use nuclear weapons against an adversary that was also armed with nuclear weapons was going to be credible. And what these information age weapons that China has developed as substitutes do is that on the one hand, they are much more threats to use them are much more credible than nuclear threats because they have this kind of genuine element of, will they or will they not trigger these really catastrophic outcomes? But they're also much faster and easier to develop than the kind of broad-based conventional military capabilities that would help China win a Taiwan contingency. So that's been the kind of, I think, key approach that's made China's approach to military capabilities and nuclear strategy in the region somewhat distinctive from what we've seen from other nuclear armed powers, including the Cold War superpowers recently. I can go on and say a little bit more about where I think they're going, why they might abandon their no first use policy if that's on the cards in the future, but we'll pause there in case, Martine, you want to push us in another direction.
No, thanks. Great. That's a great overview, Fiona. I guess might just be good to drill down, and Sam, feel free to step in on this one first. Is just to look a little bit more at the kind of the US-China strategic competition dynamic. And from your perspective, Sam, and then Fiona, you come in. Do you see, a tipping point there where China might actually be pushed into changing the strategy it's taken so far?
Well, I think on nuclear weapons, I mean, the change in strategy is actually afoot. Fiona will have a better command of the numbers than I do, but we are now seeing strong evidence of a really substantial expansion of China's strategic nuclear force, as well as the kind of non-nuclear strategic capabilities that Fiona was just describing. The nuclear weapons force is being vastly expanded. I don't think that's an exaggeration to use that term. Evidence of hundreds of new ICBM silos under construction in China. We don't know if all of those silos will actually have missiles in them. And in turn, we don't know how many warheads those missiles would carry. So there's still a lot of ambiguity there. But we also know that China's developing a full strategic nuclear triad now. So as well as this land-based element, now a fleet of 6 ballistic missile submarines. Those are still pretty substandard by US and European measures or Russian measures. But there's a new class of ballistic missile carrying submarine that will be introduced, I think, within the decade. We'll start to see them introduced, which will be much closer to the state of the art in the West and in Russia. And then secondly, I think possibly within the year, we're expecting the first flight of a new Chinese strategic bomber, which will almost certainly have nuclear missions. It will be a stealth bomber of intercontinental range, is what we're expecting. So something equivalent to the American B-2. So, in other words, within the next decade, I think we can say that they'll have a fairly mature strategic triad. So that in itself is a pretty substantial change from a very minimalist nuclear force structure that the Chinese have adopted up to this point.
Thanks, Sam. So Fiona, you want to, so acceleration of modernization, pace of modernization is definitely happening. Where do you think it's leading?
Sure. So I think Sam's given a good sort of overview of what's going on in terms of the capabilities. And I'll just add another 2 points on things that I think are quite important in changing China's nuclear forces, the nature of it themselves. One is increases in accuracy of both its theater range, so those that are within our region in the Indo-Pacific, and intercontinental range missiles, so they're becoming more accurate, and also changes to the readiness status. So China's nuclear forces have for the longest time been kept at a very low state of readiness, where the warheads and the delivery systems were kept separate. It took an order from the Politburo and the Central Military Commission, China's top military and civilian decision makers, to actually even alert the force so that you would have those warheads and missiles mated. And there have been changes in the last couple of years to at least parts of the force where they're kept at much higher rates of readiness. So that's in addition to the size and diversity changes that I think Sam has very accurately laid out. But what I think from where I sit is important to note is that changes in capabilities do not necessarily mean changes in strategy. And so while China has been very, hasn't really explained why it is making these changes to its nuclear force structure, from where I sit, it's consistent with both having a much more robust retaliatory strategy that is consistent with its no first use declaratory policy, but it is also consistent with a nuclear force that does enable China to have better options for engaging and threatening the first use of nuclear weapons. These capabilities can basically serve both of those two sorts of changes. So we need to sort of look elsewhere if we want to understand what China is actually planning to do with these changes. And I'll wager just a couple of things that I think experts are looking at that might be driving China's nuclear modernization. One is that the US-China relationship politically is getting a lot worse. And that coupled with the fact that the US continues to develop capabilities that could erode China's ability to retaliate for nuclear first strikes is simply driving China to try and shore up its retaliatory capabilities by building a much bigger, more diverse and more flexible nuclear force, but that's still really geared towards retaliation. So that's one possibility. It's kind of continuity, but in a more tense geopolitical context. The second possibility is that China is seeking more freedom of action to conduct conventional military operations in the region. And if it wants to do that, it needs a much kind of stronger nuclear shield to stop the US from threatening nuclear first use to try and keep China's conventional operations at bay. And then the third possibility is that simply there are changes to China's nuclear decision-making that we're still kind of trying to get a grasp on, that Xi Jinping has maybe different views of what nuclear weapons are useful for at the political level, or also that the military is gaining a greater sort of influence over China's nuclear decision-making. But this still doesn't tell us exactly what China's nuclear strategy in the future might end up looking like. And I think if it were to adopt a kind of first-use nuclear policy, it would happen for a couple of reasons. But the key things that I think have to change are actually China's own beliefs and understanding of what nuclear weapons are good for, from one where they doubt the credibility of making nuclear threats to one where they're more confident those threats would be treated seriously, or changes in the organizational piece that constrain China's adoption of first use in the past, because of the way that the Chinese leadership relates to its military. And finally, because it just lost confidence in this strategic substitution approach that I just laid out, that suddenly nuclear first use threats actually look like the least bad option, because for whatever reason, China's leaders just don't think counter space weapons, offensive cyber operations, and conventional missile forces are going to sort of provide the level of threat and danger that is really going to keep the US out of a future cross-strait conflict.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. So this is going to be a question that I'll start with you, Fiona, but then we'll go to Sam and also to John on this one. So you might want to just kick off on any changes to China's threat environment that could other than what you've already talked about in terms of the kind of strategic sense and what would be effective, what wouldn't be, what would be a change to China's threat environment that could prompt them to think differently about nuclear retaliation to influence a conventional conflict. And then the second part of the question, which is addressed to the three of you, is we've talked about intensifying competition and some of the asymmetries in the US-China relationship. So is there an alternative pathway which could enable the two states to effectively cooperate and reduce those nuclear risks? If you've had any thoughts about that, before we then go back to the kind of broader perspective of the rest of the region. Fiona.
Sure. So I'll just add, like I just sort of alluded to, I think that the main reasons why China, that would prompt China to abandon its no first use policy are likely to require these domestic sort of changes. That said, though, I think there are two really important external drivers that could lead China to really carefully think about making that change, or maybe three, I'll put it in this sense. One is that Japan would require nuclear weapons. I think that would be a really big game changer for how China thinks about the role of its own nuclear weapons. The second is that it viewed the United States as posing an existential threat to China. So its military continues to plan for any Taiwan contingency by calling it a local war, not a general or a total war in which it expects its adversary to try and completely eliminate it. So I think really raising up the threat the US places would lead China to perhaps rethink the role of nuclear weapons. The final piece is not really a threat environment issue, but I think it's a really important one nevertheless. And that is that China saw its reputation and its role and engagement with a lot of the global South countries and the non-aligned movement as being less important, because I think there are big reputational costs to China from abandoning a policy like no first use. And the audience really isn't just its region, but really a lot of the other countries in the area. So they're the kind of things that I would really emphasize that might lead to changes. I'll leave it to others to sort of start off on the cooperative nuclear, cooperative risk reduction possibilities, but can add some thoughts if time permits.
Thanks, Fiona. Sam.
Well, perhaps one more to add to Fiona's list would be to say that if there was some breakthrough in American missile defense capabilities that suddenly made China feel as if its still relatively small nuclear arsenal was a threat of being essentially taken out of the picture, that its retaliatory capabilities were no longer guaranteed. That's already the case. That's already having an effect, I think, on China's design of its nuclear force. But that's in a context where America's defenses against intercontinental ballistic missiles are still pretty poor. If we were to see some major breakthrough in that, then I think that would lead China to reevaluate its nuclear strategy once more. But on the solutions, look, I think at its heart here, what we're dealing with is a geopolitical contest between the United States and China for leadership in the Asia-Pacific region, and it's a question of the resolve of the two sides to actually win that contest. How badly does China want to be the undisputed strategic leader in Asia? How badly does the United States want to maintain that leadership? I think if they're both equally motivated to do so, then we are on a very dangerous path towards competition, potentially confrontation. But it seems to me the evidence at the moment doesn't yet point decisively in that direction, and in fact may point in a direction where we say that the United States will effectively, without ever openly declaring it, will effectively allow China something like a sphere of influence in the Asian region, and will be prepared to share leadership with China rather than the United States remaining unquestioningly the leading power and strategically dominant. The danger arises in what the boundaries of such a sphere of influence are, and what the implicit agreement between the United States and China turns out to be. One of the reasons that the Cold War Europe became relatively stable over the years in nuclear terms was that there was implicit agreement on the boundaries of the contest. So, when civil strife erupted in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, for instance, the NATO powers didn't intervene. I think actually that dynamic exists to this day. So NATO has, of course, intervened in the Ukraine conflict, but it hasn't used its own forces. It certainly hasn't sent its own military forces, because it implicitly is signalling that Ukraine, while important to its own security, is not such a vital security interest that kind of commitment is necessary. So I think in Asia, that's a more difficult, the boundaries of that contest, the boundaries of each sphere of influence are going to be much more difficult to draw, because there simply is not agreement on what a legitimate sphere of influence, Chinese sphere of influence, for instance, would look like. And the locus of that dispute actually, of course, is Taiwan. So there is at the moment nothing like an agreement that that Taiwan exists within a Chinese sphere of influence. My conclusion is that it seems to be impossible, and I reach this conclusion reluctantly. It seems to be impossible to find a stable balance of power between the United States and China whilst that disagreement continues. That is a sacrifice that the United States may have to make at some point.
Thanks, Sam. So, John, just before I invite you to speak, you have been thinking some time about or recalling the CBMs and the hotlines and the sort of nuclear risk reduction agreements that were negotiated between the US and mainly the then Soviet Union in the time of what we thought was the most intense Cold War possible, and that this might be a useful first step to look at between the US and China within the strategic context and challenges that Sam and Fiona have described. Your thoughts on that?
I think what's needed is engagement at a number of levels, or particularly high level, political as well as military, to simply talk through exactly the issues we've been talking about now, getting it for each party to be able to get a clearer understanding of what its interests are and where it regards its red lines to be, and to look at ways of accommodating the different interests, specifically on military contact hotlines and so on. We saw an interesting and pretty scary example during the Trump presidency, when at one stage the Chinese really thought that a nuclear attack against China was possible, and General Miley had to ring his counterpart and assure him this wasn't what the US was up to, or wasn't what Trump was up to. I think that just highlights the need for an engagement process rather than leaving it to megaphone diplomacy and interpretations of actions and so on. The parties need to have a regular dialogue process where they can talk about the problems they're concerned with and look for ways of finding mutual solutions. One of the key things in this game, returning to military affairs, one of the key things is one that Sam alluded to, missile defense. One of the many quandaries with nuclear weapons is that although it makes sense at one level to establish effective missile defense, at another level it's destabilizing, because if deterrence relies on mutual vulnerability, then as soon as one party is able to neutralize the other side's deterrent by having effective defense, that immediately makes the other side concerned that that a preemptive strike might come next. You know, that the super effective defense can then be used as a shield to enable aggression. So there needs to be a very in-depth and complicated dialogue process that goes into all these sorts of issues and looks, and the starting point has to be no one will win a nuclear war. The weapon states have already made that collective announcement just before Russia invaded Ukraine, repeating the Gorbachev-Reagan statement that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be started. I think that's got to be a starting point, and for serious and continuing discussions on how to ensure the world doesn't reach that point.
So before we go to pick up a couple of the questions, Fiona, I'll just come back to you. You live in the US and you work in the US. You also spend a lot of time in China. Now, what John and Sam have talked about, of course, all the strategic thinkers know this and are thinking about it in their own way, in their own silos, maybe even. What are, in your assessment, are the prospects of actually bringing them to the table, the major players to the table? And what could, in your opinion, countries like Australia do to facilitate such an engagement? Would it be a regionally led initiative, or would it be something that we couldn't do it on our own, presumably? Any thoughts about that before you go to the questions?
Sure. So I think the real challenge here is, again, how do you get everybody to the table? And I think that the single biggest obstacle or accelerant to the US and China actually talking about not just nuclear risks, but crisis escalation, crisis management, conflict prevention actually comes from the top. It needs to be an issue that is prioritized at the very highest levels of the leadership within China and within the United States. There's a lot of issues on the dial between those two countries to do with trade, economics, people-to-people relations, and nuclear is just not at the top of that list, I think. What is very close to the top of that list, though, is what the Chinese prefer to, I think, talk about as conflict prevention measures, which talk to some of these kind of crisis management and escalation management, not at the nuclear level, but in getting from a kind of crisis situation, whether it's something like the Pelosi visit or whether it's an accident like what we saw in 2001 with a US spy plane colliding with a Chinese fighter. So I do think that's close to the top of the priority list in the relationship, but the nuclear issue is not. So political will, I think, is one of the major issues, and that is an area where Australia, as a very close friend of the United States, does have the ability to say, hey, look, this is really important to us. It's something that we as allies in the region are concerned about, and maybe we're concerned about China's nuclear capabilities in different ways from what Japan and South Korea are. But I think I would just add two other pieces that I think are worthwhile pressing on. One is that I think the one area where the US and China are able to talk about nuclear issues is happening in the P5 process on the side of the NPT. That's one area where there is some discussion. There are limits to that kind of forum, but it is a place where, you know, at least direct discussions about some elements of nuclear weapons issues are taking place, and that's something that I think should continue to be supported. But the really big, I think, challenge to getting significant risk reduction measures in place for the US and China at the nuclear table comes from the fact that I don't think they see themselves as equal in the nuclear-only realm, in part because of the asymmetry in arsenals and in sophistication. And also because they are engaged in a strategic competition, and the United States has often looked to the nuclear piece as a place where strategic competition plays out. And so the two countries need to sort of make decisions about where they're going to compete, where they maybe are not necessarily going to compete. And that, I think, is going to open up at least a kind of clear idea of how much cooperation is actually possible between the two countries and in what ways in the nuclear space, whether it is not numerical limits, but some of, you know, things like ballistic missile and space launch notifications that you might see at a more concrete level.
Thanks. All right, I'm just going to go to a couple of the questions if I can find them. My system is now playing up too, and I can't see the questions. Let's go to, I think a couple of, you have actually addressed in the discussion a couple of these, but there's one interesting question which is a little bit, takes a slightly different angle. In the potential absence of the US's nuclear protection in the Asia Pacific, could Australia adopt components of China's traditional preference for strategies that pose a more credible threat to enemies, such as investing in conventional missiles or cyber attacks rather than resorting to adopting nuclear capabilities? If any of you would like to briefly address that. Yes, Fiona?
So I'll take a stab at this one because I think this is a question of whether that strategic substitution approach that China has preferred is applicable in Australia's position. I think the really big difference there comes from the fact that if Australia does not have an extended nuclear deterrence guarantee, then it lacks that kind of nuclear protection that dares an adversary to escalate to the nuclear level. So you'd always have the ability of any nuclear armed adversary to simply threaten to attack Australia with nuclear weapons if it were to engage in such provocative non-nuclear attacks as a way of trying to coerce and keep out its adversaries. And it would then be up to Australian decision makers as to whether those nuclear threats would be credible. So I think it really depends upon the circumstances, but certainly there's elements of China's substitution approach that are applicable, including to non-nuclear countries.
Thanks. Sam, you got any?
Yeah, I'll chime in there. And I'll just focus on Fiona's remark about Australian decision makers needing to decide whether nuclear threats are credible. So there is an argument that's made that nuclear weapons are effectively a trump card, that even if Australia could independently defend itself in conventional terms against any kind of Chinese threat, that nuclear weapons in the background would ensure that even in those circumstances, Australia would have to give in the full knowledge that should Australia even land some blows in a conventional conflict, it would still be a threat of nuclear weapons, and that's a trump card in any crisis situation. But of course, that assumes that nuclear threats are credible, and it seems to me that in the current international landscape, it's very difficult to imagine circumstances in which it would be believable for China to make nuclear threats against Australia. And in part, it's our relative smallness that protects us in this regard, because the consequences, the political, economic, strategic consequences of a nuclear attack on Australia would be so severe that the stakes would have to be incredibly high. But it's hard to imagine any conflict with Australia that the stakes would rise to that level. So therefore, it seems to me perfectly possible for Australia to organise an independent defence of itself, even without American help, if that's necessary, even outside of the American nuclear umbrella, and not go nuclear itself, simply because the credibility of Chinese nuclear threats against Australia would be extremely low. However, such a defence strategy, I think, would have to take into account the possibility that if a conflict were to escalate, then maybe China's interests and China's reputation would be engaged to such an extent that nuclear use suddenly becomes more credible. Nuclear threats become more credible. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's in Australia's interest to organise itself in its defence terms, such that no conflict ever reaches that level. So we should always adopt a defence posture that is non-escalatory, that keeps the stakes in any potential conflict very low, such that China's larger interests are not engaged. And you won't be shocked to hear, Martine, that that's exactly the proposal I've come up with in the Echidna strategy.
Okay. Look, thank you. Look, we've only got a minute left. And so this is a question, and I think I might go to John very quickly, but it does lead us into our third webinar when we start trying to unpack what are some of the things that can be done that we've all touched on a little bit in today's discussion. So, which specific mechanisms for risk reduction would be useful in the Indo-Pacific, and how can Australia engage with these institutions to achieve substantive outcomes? John, do you want to just give you a little bit your thinking on this, where we should be heading, and then Sam and Fiona, really literally 5 seconds each.
Well, we've touched on it briefly. Australia has influence in a number of capitals, Washington being the obvious one, but also in the region. And I think a starting point should be that we use that influence to encourage the weapon states to understand their own self-interest better, and to see the value of risk reduction. So, and I just pick on China as a particular example. China has made it clear it is not interested in engagement in arms control, but I think China sees that simply as a matter of arsenal numbers, and I think sort of an explanation process would be worthwhile to talk about all the other reduction measures that could be taken that are very much in China's interest. They may not have thought this through. And from there, we should think in terms of, is there a place for a regional security institution for that all parties can exchange views in? But we're a long way from that, in my view. It needs to start with a series of one-on-ones to generate some momentum.
Okay, look, I'm sorry, Sam and Fiona, we really are out of time, but I think that's a good place to stop. Just wanted to quickly alert those of you who are listening that the third webinar that we are going to start unpacking some of the suggestions and what might be some of the ways forward, including what countries like Australia might be able to contribute, will take place on the 6th of November. We already have confirmed Melissa Park, the newly minted CEO of ICANN, and Professor Andrew O'Neill, the Executive Dean, Faculty of Law and Business at the Australian Catholic University. We will, of course, let everybody know closer to the time with a link to that. Also, the link, you can see this webinar today on YouTube. It'll be posted out this afternoon by the team, just to catch up and of course to share with all of your colleagues and anyone else who's interested in these matters. We'll also repost the first webinar that we ran with Gareth Evans and Peter Varghese. I just wanted to finally thank very, very warmly our 3 expert participants. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. We very much hope this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. You're all cordially invited to our next webinar, by the way, Sam, Fiona, and John, to chip in and ask tricky questions of the participants on that occasion. And we do hope that we'll be able to carry on this discussion and really come up with some concrete recommendations for governments going forward. But in the meantime, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much to our panelists and for overcoming the slight technical glitches that we had. You were all there right at the right time, so it all worked out extremely well. So we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar on the 6th of November. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Martine.